In the silent ruins of ancient Mesopotamia, archaeologists unearthed traces of a forgotten power, the remains of an empire that once ruled the known world with iron and intellect. Beneath layers of sand and time lay fragments of its glory. Stone libraries filled with tablets, reliefs carved in unyielding stone, and palaces that once dazzled with gold and cedar. All of them pointed to a single name: Assyria. Who were the Assyrians? How did a modest settlement on the banks of the Tigris River transform into the first great military superpower of human history? And what forces led to its collapse, leaving only dust and legend behind? This is the story of the Assyrian Empire, a civilization forged by trade, faith, and conquest. Long before Assyria's legions marched across the Near East, it began as a humble city-state. Its name came from Ashur, both the city itself and its chief deity. Situated on the west bank of the Tigris in modern northern Iraq, Ashur was neither vast nor wealthy in its earliest days. It was one among many rival city-states scattered across northern Mesopotamia, overshadowed by the more advanced southern centers of Sumer, like Lagash and Kish, which had already built monumental temples and complex bureaucracies. Yet geography favored Ashur. Its position at the crossroads of trade routes linking the mineral-rich mountains of Anatolia to the fertile plains of southern Mesopotamia gave it a natural advantage. The river provided transport. The land provided food. Over centuries, this quiet city would become the heartbeat of an empire. Archaeological evidence traces human activity in Ashur back to the 3rd millennium BCE, during the early dynastic period. The people of this northern land lived between competing worlds, the bustling Sumerian south and the wilder highlands to the north. It was a region of exchange and adaptation. While Sumer excelled in irrigation and bureaucracy, northern Mesopotamia offered temperate lands, rainfall, and proximity to crucial trade resources like timber and metals. This combination made Ashur an ideal hub for merchants seeking profit and for rulers seeking control. In the 24th century BCE, the rise of the Akkadian Empire under Sargon of Akkad reshaped Mesopotamia. For the first time, a single ruler united the cities under imperial administration. Though Ashur was still a minor outpost, it came under Akkadian control. The language, bureaucracy, and religious systems of Akkad left a permanent imprint. Akkadian became the language of record and power, adopted by the scribes and merchants of Ashur. From this imperial encounter, Assyria absorbed the habits of empire: record-keeping, diplomacy, and the belief that divine order could be maintained through centralized authority. When the Akkadian Empire collapsed in the late 22nd century BCE, Mesopotamia fragmented once again. City-states fought for survival, and from this turmoil, Ashur began to assert itself. Its strength was not found in armies, but in commerce. By the 20th century BCE, Assyria entered what historians call the Old Assyrian period, the first stage of its long ascent. The merchants of Ashur became the lifeblood of the city's expansion. They formed caravans that stretched hundreds of miles into Anatolia, establishing trade colonies known as karums. The most famous of these was Kanesh, modern-day Kultepe, Turkey. There, Assyrian traders exchanged tin and textiles for Anatolian silver and copper, commodities that powered the Bronze Age economy. Unlike later empires, this early Assyrian network was not built by conquest, but by trust, contract, and record. Archaeologists have uncovered thousands of clay tablets from Kanesh, contracts, business letters, marriage agreements, and complaints about delayed payments, all sealed with the personal stamps of merchants. These tablets reveal a society driven by calculation and kinship, where families acted as both financiers and diplomats. At home, Ashur's political system reflected this commercial spirit. The ruler was known as the Ishiach Ashur, or steward of the god Ashur, emphasizing that true kingship belonged to the deity, not the man. The king was more administrator than conqueror, a mediator between the divine and civic order. Major decisions were made through a council of elders and merchant elites, a rare form of oligarchic cooperation in the ancient world. This system, grounded in both faith and pragmatism, helped Assyria endure through chaos when other states fell. Religion in early Assyria revolved around balance between God and king, trade and duty, prosperity and piety. The god Ashur began as a solar and fertility deity, but evolved into a symbol of sovereignty and divine war. As the city's fortunes grew, so did his image. By later centuries, Ashur would embody the destiny of empire itself, a god of conquest and order, mirrored in the ambitions of his people. Yet, in these early centuries, faith was still domestic, local, and communal. Festivals, temple offerings, and rituals were as much about maintaining social unity as invoking divine power. By the 18th century BCE, Ashur faced new challenges. The Amorite king Shamshi-Adad III conquered the city, integrating it into a broader northern Mesopotamian kingdom. Though not ethnically Assyrian, Shamshi-Adad transformed the city's governance, introducing standardized administration and expanding the use of written bureaucracy. His sons were placed in key territories, and correspondence flowed constantly between capitals. This network, an early form of centralized communication, would later inspire the administrative precision that became the hallmark of Assyrian rule. After Shamshi-Adad's death, his kingdom disintegrated. Assyria entered centuries of fluctuation, sometimes independent, sometimes under the sway of Babylon or the Hurrian kingdom of Mitanni. Yet the roots of empire had already taken hold. The Assyrians had learned the art of management, diplomacy, and patience. They would wait, adapt, and rise again. By the dawn of the second millennium BCE, Assyria was no longer a nameless city along the Tigris. It had become a network of merchants, scribes, and administrators, with influence stretching from the mountains of Anatolia to the plains of Mesopotamia. This period was not yet the age of conquest. It was the age of foundation, of trade routes, legal codes, and cultural synthesis. The Assyrians, still traders rather than warriors, were quietly building the architecture of empire long before their armies marched. Ashur's people saw their god not only as protector, but as destiny. The city, they believed, was chosen to bring order where chaos reigned. That belief, born in the marketplaces of Kanesh and the temples of Ashur, would, in centuries to come, drive kings to conquer continents in his name. The river that once carried merchants' boats would soon carry war chariots, and the god of the city would become the god of empire. The web of commerce. The old Assyrian expansion. By the dawn of the second millennium BCE, Assyria had stepped beyond the limits of a city-state. Its reach extended far beyond the walls of Ashur, carried on the backs of caravans and written in the clay tablets of merchants. What began as local trade along the Tigris River had evolved into one of the most advanced commercial networks of the ancient world. A web that stretched hundreds of miles northward into Anatolia and westward into unknown lands. This was not yet an empire of soldiers, but of merchants, contracts, and seals. It was, in many ways, the first global economy. The merchants of Ashur were more than traders. They were the architects of Assyrian prosperity. Traveling through rugged mountain passes and dry plains, they established semi-autonomous colonies known as kharams, trading districts embedded within foreign cities. Among these, the kharam at Kanesh, modern Kultepe, Turkey, stands as the most famous and well-documented. Excavations there have revealed thousands of clay tablets inscribed in Old Assyrian cuneiform, each tablet a snapshot of daily life. Accounts of tin shipments, letters between fathers and sons, or promises sworn before gods and witnesses. Tin and textiles formed the backbone of this trade. Tin was especially precious, the key ingredient for making bronze, the metal that defined the age. Assyria itself possessed no native tin sources, so its merchants acted as intermediaries, bringing tin from the east and trading it for silver from Anatolia. In turn, Assyria's fine wool textiles were prized across the Near East. This triangular flow of goods, tin, silver, and textiles, sustained Assyria for generations and created a shared economic world long before the idea of empire emerged. But commerce alone did not build stability. The Assyrian kings of this period, still known as stewards of Ashur, understood that prosperity required order. They did not command great armies or build massive fortifications. Instead, they governed through law and reputation. Royal decrees regulated weights, measures, and taxes, ensuring fairness in trade and consistency in record-keeping. Merchants trusted in the system, and foreign rulers respected it, because Assyrian contracts carried divine authority. A transaction made in the name of Ashur was not easily broken. One of the earliest rulers to leave his mark on this commercial world was Ashurnasirpal II, who reigned in the early 20th century BCE. He commissioned temples to Ashur and established legal reforms that protected merchants and stabilized trade. His successors, Ikunum and Sargon I, continued these efforts, balancing religious piety with economic pragmatism. These kings did not rule through conquest, but through cooperation. Their influence radiated outward along the trade routes, invisible yet powerful. The letters recovered from Kanesh reveal a strikingly human world behind this economic engine. Merchants wrote to their families in Ashur with affection, frustration, and humor. They complained about unreliable partners, delayed caravans, and the risks of crossing dangerous terrain. Some letters describe clever financial maneuvers, fathers teaching sons how to diversify investments, or wives managing accounts back home. One merchant warns his brother to guard the seals carefully, for a broken seal is the ruin of a house. Another laments, "The road is full of thieves, and the silver delayed, yet the gods will bless the patient." Through their words, we glimpse the soul of early Assyrian life, ambitious, disciplined, and deeply bound by faith. Assyrian merchants also acted as informal diplomats. They negotiated safe passage with local Anatolian rulers, settled disputes between city-states, and even influenced regional politics through trade alliances. In this way, Assyria extended its influence without armies or coercion. The pen, or rather the stylus pressed into clay, became its weapon of choice. Still, the system was not without tension. The wealth that flowed through Ashur brought both opportunity and inequality. Prominent merchant families grew powerful, sometimes rivaling royal authority. To maintain balance, the kings of Ashur strengthened their moral claim to rule by invoking the divine will of their god. Ashur was no longer merely a local deity. He was becoming the divine embodiment of the Assyrian people. The city and its god were inseparable. To honor one was to serve the other. This merging of civic and divine identity would shape Assyria's destiny. The concept of kingship evolved from stewardship to sacred duty. The ruler was not simply a caretaker. He was the chosen intermediary of Ashur's will. In later centuries, this ideology would justify conquest and empire. But during the Old Assyrian period, it served a gentler purpose: to preserve order amid prosperity. Around the 18th century BCE, Assyria came under the shadow of greater powers. The Amorite ruler Shamshi-Adad I, originally from the northwestern city of Ekalatum, seized Ashur and declared himself king. Though a foreigner, he transformed Assyrian governance. He reorganized territories, standardized record-keeping, and imposed a centralized administration that spanned much of northern Mesopotamia. His correspondence with his sons, stationed in major cities such as Mari and Nineveh, provides one of the earliest examples of bureaucratic communication. These letters, preserved on clay, reveal a man obsessed with control, logistics, and discipline. He monitored grain stores, troop movements, and local governors with the precision of a modern administrator. Shamshi-Adad's rule marked a turning point. Under him, Assyria briefly shifted from a mercantile power to a political and military one. Yet, after his death, the fragile network he built quickly unraveled. His sons failed to maintain unity, and neighboring powers, including Hammurabi of Babylon, absorbed Assyrian territories. For several centuries, Assyria would remain subdued, its influence confined once more to the Tigris heartland. Despite this decline, the legacy of the Old Assyrian period endured. The habits of record-keeping, the respect for contract law, and the pragmatic diplomacy of its merchants formed the skeleton of the future empire. When later Assyrian kings expanded through war, they built upon the foundations laid by these early traders. The soldiers of the future marched along the same routes once followed by caravans. The empire of the sword was born from the empire of the stylus. Religion continued to anchor Assyrian identity. The god Ashur stood at the center of their worldview, but his image was subtly changing. In the beginning, he was the protector of trade and fertility. Over time, he became the embodiment of divine kingship and victory. The transformation mirrored that of the state itself, from city to kingdom, from merchant guild to military empire. By worshipping Ashur, the Assyrians sanctified their ambition. By the end of the 17th century BCE, the old trade routes began to falter. Political upheavals swept through Mesopotamia and Anatolia, disrupting commerce. The rise of new powers such as Babylon in the south and Mitanni in the northwest isolated Assyria. The once flourishing Karams fell silent, their archives sealed by time and ash. Yet within the city of Ashur, the spirit of resilience remained. Its scribes continued to copy ancient texts. Its priests maintained rituals that had endured for centuries. The city waited, patient, disciplined, and unbroken. The old Assyrian age closed not with a fall, but with a pause. In the centuries ahead, the merchants' descendants would trade their ledgers for weapons, their caravans for armies. The same meticulous order that governed contracts would govern conquests. Assyria was learning that power, whether in trade or in war, came from structure, faith, and endurance. And when it rose again, it would do so not as a trading city, but as a kingdom of destiny. The shadows of subjugation. The rise of the Middle Assyrian kingdom. When the old Assyrian merchants faded from the mountain roads and the Karums fell silent, Assyria entered a long, dim twilight. For nearly half a millennium, from the 17th century BCE to the 14th century BCE, the once bustling city of Ashur lay trapped between greater powers. To the south rose mighty Babylon, heir to Hammurabi's legacy and master of the lower Tigris and Euphrates. To the northwest stood the Hurrian kingdom of Mitanni, a warrior aristocracy whose chariots thundered across northern Mesopotamia. Between these giants, Assyria seemed destined to remain a vassal, quiet, diminished, and forgotten. Yet within that silence, the city endured, preserving the knowledge and institutions that would one day revive its greatness. The fall of Shamshi-Adad I's kingdom had left Assyria fractured. His administrative brilliance could not survive the ambitions of his sons, and soon the territories he had bound together were seized by rivals. In this chaos, Ashur struggled to maintain independence. Babylonian influence reached northward, imposing its language, gods, and laws. Later, the Hurrians extended their sway from the west, weaving Assyria into the political web of Mitanni. To the outside world, it seemed that Assyria's destiny was to serve, not to rule. But subjugation is a strange teacher. Under foreign oversight, Assyria learned the strengths and weaknesses of its masters. Babylon taught it the art of codified law and the use of religion as an instrument of legitimacy. From the Hurrians, it inherited new military techniques, chariot warfare, metallurgy, and the organization of elite warrior classes. Even in subservience, Assyria absorbed what it needed to build something stronger. For historians, this time is often called Assyria's Dark Age. Few inscriptions survive, and what remains comes mostly from foreign archives, mentions of tribute sent from Ashur, or governors reporting to Mitanni overlords. Yet these fragments tell us something profound. The city did not die. Its temples still functioned, its priests still performed rituals to the god Ashur, and its scribes continued to write. The Assyrian state shrank, but its identity persisted like an ember beneath the ashes. By the 15th century BCE, the geopolitical landscape of the Near East had shifted dramatically. A new balance of power emerged. 4 great states dominated the region: Egypt, Babylon, Mitanni, and the Hittite Empire of Anatolia. Diplomacy among them was formalized through treaties, marriages, and letters written in Akkadian, the lingua franca of the time. Yet in this concert of empires, Assyria was conspicuously absent. It had become a regional backwater, mentioned only as a dependency of Mitanni. Still, within its walls, the people of Ashur remembered a different past, one of merchants, kings, and divine favor. That memory would soon awaken. The turning point came in the 14th century BCE. The kingdom of Mitanni, strained by internal conflict and external pressure from the rising Hittites under Shuppiluliuma I, began to weaken. The empire that had dominated northern Mesopotamia for centuries started to crumble. And in that moment of instability, Assyria moved to reclaim its freedom. A new ruler ascended the throne, Ashur-uballit II, a man of vision and audacity. His name, meaning Ashur has given life, carried prophetic weight. He understood that Assyria's survival depended on more than quiet endurance. It required assertion. Under his leadership, Assyria broke its chains of vassalage and declared independence from Mitanni. But Ashur-uballit did not stop there. He began to expand, not through reckless conquest, but through calculated diplomacy and precise warfare. Ashur-uballit forged alliances with powerful neighbors, including Egypt, whose pharaoh received his letters as part of the Amarna correspondence, a collection of royal tablets found centuries later that revealed the web of international politics in the late Bronze Age. In these letters, the Assyrian king addressed the pharaoh as an equal, an astonishing declaration for a nation that had only recently escaped subjugation. It was a statement not just of pride, but of legitimacy. Assyria was once again a great power. Militarily, Ashur-uballit moved swiftly. He took advantage of Mitanni's decline, capturing border territories and consolidating control over the Tigris Valley. His campaigns brought new wealth and manpower into Assyria. The once quiet city of Ashur became a fortified stronghold, its walls rebuilt, its temples renewed. The god Ashur, long confined to a local cult, now emerged as the universal deity of empire, lord of kings, master of the world. The theology of conquest was taking shape. With independence secured, The Middle Assyrian period began. It was an age of transformation, of aggressive expansion, administrative reform, and ideological clarity. The kings who followed Ashurbanipal continued his work, each building upon the foundations of the last. Among them, Adad-nirari III and Shalmaneser. I stood out as conquerors and lawgivers. They defeated what remained of Mitanni, extended Assyrian control deep into Syria, and established the first provincial system of governance in Mesopotamian history. Adad-nirari I's reign, in particular, marked the emergence of Assyria as a true empire. He reorganized conquered lands into provinces ruled by officials appointed directly by the king, a model later perfected by the Persians and Romans. These governors were responsible for tax collection, law enforcement, and the mobilization of troops. Reports flowed regularly back to the capital, ensuring the king's eye reached every corner of his realm. Assyria had learned from its past. Where merchants once kept records of trade, now bureaucrats recorded tribute and conquest. The empire's foundation was papered in clay. Religion, as always, mirrored politics. The god Ashur was redefined once again, no longer just the city's guardian, but the divine force of universal order. The king ruled not merely by right of lineage, but as the earthly embodiment of Ashur's will. Every campaign became a holy act, every victory divine proof. The fusion of faith and power created a potent ideology that would sustain Assyria for centuries and terrify its enemies. Culturally, the Middle Assyrian Age was also a time of codification. The Middle Assyrian laws, inscribed on clay tablets, reveal a society deeply concerned with order, hierarchy, and discipline. They covered matters of property, marriage, and crime with a severity that reflected the empire's militarized ethos. Yet these laws also demonstrate a sophisticated sense of justice and an obsession with accountability, traits inherited from Assyria's mercantile past. Under Shalmaneser I and his successors, Assyria pushed its frontiers westward, seizing control of vital trade routes and cities like Carchemish along the Euphrates. The army grew into a professional institution, disciplined and efficient. Bronze gave way to iron, chariots evolved into more mobile formations. The Assyrian war machine, that terrifying symbol of later centuries, was beginning to take shape. But perhaps the most emblematic ruler of this era was Tukulti-Ninurta, reigned c. no 1244–1208 BCE, a king of immense ambition and intellect. He waged war against Babylon, capturing its capital and even seizing the statue of its chief god, Marduk, a shocking act that proclaimed Assyria's supremacy over its ancient rival. For the first time, a ruler from the north called himself King of Sumer and Akkad, uniting both halves of Mesopotamia under one crown. Tukulti-Ninurta also founded a new royal city, Kar-Tukulti-Ninurta, across the river from Ashur, a grand experiment in urban and ideological renewal. Its temples and palaces proclaimed that Assyria had achieved divine sanction to rule the world, yet greatness carried a price. Tukulti-Ninurta's reforms and religious innovations, particularly his elevation of Ashur above all other gods, alienated parts of the priesthood and nobility. Eventually, rebellion erupted within his own family. The king was overthrown and killed in his palace, his empire left to unravel. Assyria entered a period of instability, though the structures Tukulti-Ninurta built would endure. By the end of the 12th century BCE, the Middle Assyrian kingdom stood battered but unbroken. The Near East itself was in upheaval. The Hittite Empire collapsed, Egypt weakened, and waves of migrations reshaped the political map. Amid this turmoil, Assyria survived. Its armies retreated to defend the homeland. Its bureaucrats preserved the machinery of state. When the storm of the late Bronze Age collapse finally passed, Assyria remained standing, scarred, diminished, but alive. And as the old world crumbled around it, the seeds of the next great age, the Neo-Assyrian Empire, began to stir beneath the stones of Ashur. By the early 12th century BCE, the empire forged by Ashurbanipal III and expanded by Adad-nirari Furin, Shalmaneser-Onri, and Tukulti-Ninurta had become one of the most disciplined and organized states in the ancient world. From the mountains of Anatolia to the plains of Babylon, Assyria's influence stretched across a vast expanse of the Near East. Its kings saw themselves not merely as rulers, but as divine instruments, stewards of Ashur, chosen to impose order upon chaos. The Middle Assyrian Empire stood at its height, a kingdom of conquest, bureaucracy, and belief, poised between the old Bronze Age world and the dawn of a new imperial age. At the heart of this transformation was Tiglath-Pileser I, a warrior king whose reign, beginning around 1114 BCE, marked both a culmination and a rebirth. He inherited a realm scarred by decades of decline and encroachment. Nomadic Aramean tribes pressed from the west, threatening the fertile lands of the upper Tigris. Mountain peoples in the north tested Assyrian borders. Trade routes had withered, and memories of Tukulti-Ninurta's grandeur had begun to fade. But Tiglath-Pileser was no caretaker. He was a conqueror, reformer, and visionary who sought to restore Assyria's divine mandate. From the moment he ascended the throne, Tiglath-Pileser III set out to reclaim the empire's lost vigor. His inscriptions, carved deep into stone and written across palace walls, resound with confidence and command. "I crossed the Euphrates River 28 times," one boasts, "pursuing my enemies and extending the boundaries of my land." Though such claims were surely embellished, they reveal his determination to reassert Assyrian supremacy across the Near East. His campaigns were methodical and relentless. To the north, Tiglath-Pileser marched into Nairi, a region of rugged mountains and fiercely independent tribes. These lands were rich in timber and metals, essential for Assyria's economy and weapon production. The king subdued them through force and diplomacy, exacting tribute and hostages to secure loyalty. In the west, he crossed the Euphrates, reaching the Mediterranean Sea, a symbolic gesture that linked Assyria to the fabled lands of the coast. "I washed my weapons in the Great Sea," he proclaimed, establishing a precedent that later kings would emulate. To the east, Tiglath-Pileser campaigned against the Zagros mountain tribes, ensuring control over trade routes that connected Mesopotamia to Iran and beyond. Each victory was carefully recorded, each tribute tallied. His conquests were not random acts of aggression, but part of a coherent vision to rebuild Assyria's economic and strategic foundations. For Tiglath-Pileser, war was administration by other means, yet conquest alone could not sustain an empire. Tiglath-Pileser understood that true power required structure. He reformed the army, transforming it from a seasonal levy into a standing force, a body of professional soldiers supported by state resources. Garrisons and fortresses were established across frontier zones to secure borders and monitor rebellious provinces. These fortified centers became the backbone of Assyria's enduring control, a model later perfected by the Neo-Assyrian kings. At the same time, Tiglath-Pileser I reinforced royal authority over the provincial governors. These officials, once semi-autonomous, were brought firmly under the crown's supervision. The king's scribes maintained meticulous records of tribute, harvests, and military service. The administrative machine of Assyria hummed with precision. In this system, loyalty was enforced not only by fear, but by efficiency. Religion, as always, stood at the center of royal ideology. Tiglath-Pileser's devotion to the god Ashur defined his kingship. He restored and expanded the great temple of Ashur in the capital, adorning it with inscriptions that celebrated both divine favor and royal duty. To rebuild the temple was to renew the covenant between God and king, a covenant that legitimized every act of conquest. He also revived festivals and rituals that had lapsed during times of decline, reinforcing a sense of continuity and sacred destiny. In his eyes, the sword and the scepter were not separate symbols, but twin expressions of divine will. But Tiglath-Pileser was more than a warrior priest. He was a scholar and builder, one of the first Assyrian monarchs to style himself as both conqueror and custodian of civilization. His inscriptions speak of his knowledge of languages and his passion for ancient texts. He ordered the repair of temples throughout Assyria and revived the city of Ashur as a cultural and religious center. Under his patronage, scribes copied old literary works, preserving the traditions of earlier ages. In this sense, Tiglath-Pileser prefigured later kings like Ashurbanipal, who would turn Assyria into a sanctuary of learning. Economically, his reign saw the revival of long-distance trade. The security of routes from the Mediterranean to the Zagros restored prosperity to Assyria's merchants. Timber, copper, horses, and luxury goods flowed into the capital. Tribute from subdued peoples, silver from Anatolia, gold from the Levant, lapis lazuli from the east, filled Assyria's treasuries. The empire once again became the economic heart of Mesopotamia. The Tigris, lined with warehouses and docks, pulsed with life as caravans and boats carried goods under the watchful eyes of royal inspectors. Tiglath-Pileser also reasserted Assyria's presence on the international stage. With the collapse of the Hittite Empire and the weakening of Egypt, the Near East was in flux. In this vacuum, Assyria emerged as the dominant force. The king's inscriptions reveal diplomatic correspondence with distant rulers, some offering gifts, others pleading for peace. To them, Tiglath-Pileser presented himself not merely as a monarch, but as king of the universe, a title echoing the ambitions of Sargon of Akkad 1,000 years before. Through word and deed, he declared that Assyria was the chosen instrument of divine order. Still, the king's achievements were not immune to the tides of history. After his death, the empire he revived began to weaken once more. Successors struggled to maintain the far-flung territories he had conquered. The relentless pressure of Aramean migrations from the west proved particularly destabilizing. These nomadic tribes, pushed by drought and political turmoil, poured into Mesopotamia, raiding settlements and disrupting agriculture. The Assyrian heartland, though fortified, could not escape their incursions. Gradually, the frontiers contracted. The broader world, too, was changing. The Late Bronze Age collapse, a cataclysm that brought down empires from Mycenaean Greece to Hittite Anatolia, reshaped the entire eastern Mediterranean. Trade routes vanished, cities were abandoned, and populations shifted. Assyria, though scarred, endured, but its imperial ambitions were checked. The Middle Assyrian age of expansion gave way to an era of survival. For nearly 2 centuries after Tiglath-Pileser's death, Assyria drifted through uncertainty. The administrative systems he built persisted, but the kingdom's reach diminished. Provincial governors gained autonomy, and the throne passed through weak hands. The old cities, Nineveh, Arbela, Kalhu, languished, their temples maintained, but their granaries half empty. The once proud army became reactive rather than aggressive, fighting to defend borders rather than extend them. And yet, Assyria's flame did not go out. Within the heartland, the triangle formed by Ashur, Nineveh, and Arbela, the traditions of kingship and bureaucracy survived. The gods were still worshipped, the tablets still written, the fortresses still manned. The Assyrians, hardened by centuries of rise and fall, learned patience once again. The empire rested, but it did not die. From this pause, a new generation would rise, kings who would reclaim the glory of Tiglath-Pileser III and expand it beyond imagination. When they came, they would build cities of stone and fire, armies that marched across continents, and palaces that would awe the ancient world. The Middle Assyrian kingdom, disciplined and relentless, had laid the blueprint. What would come next, the Neo-Assyrian Empire, would be nothing less than the world's first great military superpower. The sword had been sharpened. The scepter had been raised. The age of conquest was about to begin. The storm of iron, the Neo-Assyrian rise under Ashurdan II and Adad-nirari II. By the dawn of the 10th century BCE, the once great Assyrian kingdom was a shadow of its former self. The glory of Tiglath-Pileser had faded into memory, and the realm he had revived was fractured by generations of weak kings, nomadic incursions, and economic decline. The great cities of Ashur, Nineveh, and Arbela still stood, but their walls bore scars of neglect. Their temples whispered prayers for survival rather than victory. The empire that had once reached the Mediterranean now barely controlled the Tigris Valley. And yet, within this desolate calm, a quiet resurgence began, one that would ignite into the most formidable empire the ancient world had ever seen. The late Middle Assyrian period had left behind two enduring strengths: an unbroken administrative tradition and a hardened sense of divine destiny. The machinery of empire, governors, scribes, temples, and fortresses still functioned, even in decline. And the faith in Ashur, the god of order and kingship, remained absolute. This unyielding belief would become the cornerstone of Assyria's rebirth. From these ashes rose Ashurdan II, the king who would rebuild the kingdom's foundations and prepare it for an age of iron and empire. Ashurdan II came to the throne in the early 10th century BCE, inheriting a realm surrounded by chaos. The Arameans, semi-nomadic tribes from the western deserts, had settled across northern Mesopotamia, seizing lands, raiding villages, and cutting Assyria off from vital trade routes. To the south, Babylonia had regained strength, while in the north and east, mountain tribes threatened the borders. It was a world in turmoil, but also one ripe for reclamation. Where his predecessors had retreated, Ashurdan advanced. His strategy was methodical, not grandiose. He did not begin by chasing distant conquests, but by reclaiming what had been lost. His campaigns focused on the Assyrian heartland, the triangle between Ashur, Nineveh, and Arbela, restoring agriculture, rebuilding fortresses, and repopulating abandoned lands. Records from his reign describe the redigging of canals, the restoration of irrigation systems, and the resettlement of farmers in depopulated regions. These were acts of both economic necessity and political symbolism. To make the land fertile again was to prove that Ashur's favor had returned. Ashurdan II also reformed the military, reviving the discipline that had once defined Assyria's armies. The troops of his day were no longer the weary militias of decline, but organized forces trained for long campaigns. Garrisons were established in reclaimed territories, securing the frontier against Aramean incursions. He fortified mountain passes, rebuilt bridges, and reopened trade roads that had lain abandoned for generations. Slowly, the map of Assyria began to expand again. His inscriptions, though terse, reveal a man of determination and faith. He spoke of restoring the decrees of Ashur, of bringing back the people who had been scattered. To him, conquest was not ambition, it was restoration. Every campaign was framed as an act of divine order, a fulfillment of duty rather than desire. This subtle shift in ideology would shape Assyrian kingship for centuries to come. The king was not merely a warrior, he was the instrument of cosmic balance. Under his rule, the Assyrian heartland flourished once more. Fields that had been abandoned now yielded grain. Temples long neglected were rededicated. The city of Ashur, the sacred capital, regained its old splendor. The god's image was paraded once again through the streets during festivals, the sound of drums and chants echoing along the riverbanks. The people, after centuries of uncertainty, began to believe that destiny was returning to their side. When Ashurdan II died, he left behind not a sprawling empire, but a strong, unified core, the anvil upon which future kings would forge the Neo-Assyrian Empire. His successor, Adad-Nirari II, inherited this foundation and turned it into a weapon. Ascending the throne around 911 BCE, Adad-Nirari II represented a new breed of Assyrian ruler, pragmatic, ruthless, and driven by a sense of divine inevitability. He had learned from the cautious consolidation of his father, but his ambitions reached far beyond mere survival. His reign marks the true beginning of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, the dawn of an era that would reshape the Near East. Adad-Nirari II's first campaigns struck southward into Babylonia, where the borderlands had long been contested. The Babylonians, accustomed to Assyria's weakness, were unprepared for the resurgence. In a series of swift, decisive battles, Adad-Nirari reclaimed disputed territories along the Middle Tigris and imposed treaties that favored Assyrian interests. His inscriptions proudly declare that he subdued Karduniash, the Assyrian name for Babylonia, and forced its kings to pay tribute. This marked the first major victory of the Neo-Assyrian age and signaled that the balance of power in Mesopotamia had shifted northward once more. With his southern border secured, Adad-Nirari turned west and north. His armies swept into the Zagros Mountains, subduing local tribes and establishing garrisons along key passes. He then advanced toward the upper Tigris and Euphrates, crushing the Aramean principalities that had fragmented the region. Town by town, stronghold by stronghold, Assyria reclaimed the roots that connected it to Anatolia and Syria. The campaign was not merely one of conquest, but of reorganization. Each captured region was transformed into a province, governed by a royal appointee who reported directly to the palace. Taxes, troops, and tribute flowed to the capital in a steady rhythm, reviving the economic arteries of empire. For the first time in generations, Assyria was no longer defensive, it was ascendant. The army, now fully professionalized, became a permanent institution, supported by a robust bureaucracy. Engineers and scribes marched with soldiers, recording spoils, mapping territories, and building roads. The empire functioned as a single organism, every campaign feeding both its economy and its ideology. Adad-Nirari II also solidified internal control. He curtailed the power of the provincial nobility, ensuring that governors owed loyalty to the throne alone. Corruption and rebellion were met with swift, public punishment. The Assyrian state, once weakened by factionalism, became rigidly centralized. The king's word was law, his authority divine. In the royal inscriptions, he speaks as both servant and sovereign. Ashur, my lord, commanded me to subdue the lands. I obeyed his command and restored his dominion. This fusion of faith and power created a model of kingship that would define Assyria's golden age. Culturally, the Neo-Assyrian revival rekindled the traditions of earlier centuries. Temples were rebuilt in Ashur and Nineveh, adorned with reliefs depicting the gods granting victory to the king. The scribal schools revived their craft, copying ancient texts and composing new ones that celebrated the empire's rebirth. Artisans returned to work, producing intricate bronzes, ceramics, and statuary that reflected a renewed sense of purpose. Even language evolved. The Old Assyrian dialect gave way to a standardized imperial Akkadian, the voice of empire. But beneath the order and prosperity lay a new spirit, one of unyielding expansion. The Assyrians, hardened by centuries of struggle, now saw conquest as divine destiny. Each victory was proof of the gods' favor, each defeat a lapse in piety. The king was the executor of a sacred mission, to bring the world under the dominion of Ashur. This ideology transformed war into worship, empire into theology. By the end of Adad-nirari Tiku's reign, Assyria had reclaimed its borders, restored its economy, and revived its military supremacy. The foundations were set for the colossal expansion that would follow under his successors. The empire was once again ready to reach beyond its rivers, toward the mountains, deserts, and seas that lay ahead. From the quiet restoration of Ashurdan II to the thunderous campaigns of Adad-nirari II, the rebirth of Assyria was complete. The storm that had been gathering for centuries was about to break upon the world, a storm of iron, chariots, and divine fire. The kings to come would carry that storm across continents, turning the Assyrian name into both legend and terror. The Age of Expansion. The Neo-Assyrian Empire under Ashurnasirpal II and Shalmaneser III. By the early 9th century BCE, Assyria had risen from the dust of decline to become a kingdom reborn. The quiet reforms of Ashurdan II and the iron will of Adad-nirari II had forged a disciplined state, wealthy, organized, and armed with purpose. But now, the empire's ambitions could no longer be contained within its rivers and valleys. The kings of this new age sought not mere restoration, but dominion. What began as recovery would soon become the most relentless campaign of expansion the Near East had ever witnessed. The architects of this transformation were two of the most formidable monarchs in Assyrian history, Ashurnasirpal II and his son Shalmaneser III. When Ashurnasirpal II ascended the throne in 883 BCE, he inherited a strong, stable kingdom and turned it into an engine of conquest. He was the embodiment of a new Assyrian ideal, a ruler who was not only a general and administrator, but also a living symbol of divine authority. His inscriptions thunder with the confidence of a man who believed himself chosen by the gods to subjugate the world. He was ruthless, brilliant, and unrelenting, a man whose reign transformed Assyria into an imperial juggernaut. From the beginning, Ashurnasirpal's strategy was clear: expansion through fear and control. His armies marched westward into Syria, north into Anatolia, and east into the Zagros Mountains, crushing resistance with methodical efficiency. His campaigns were recorded in chilling detail on clay tablets and palace walls. Cities that resisted were stormed and destroyed. Captives were executed or deported. Entire populations were relocated to serve the empire's needs. These records were not just chronicles of victory. They were instruments of psychological warfare. Every gruesome depiction carved into stone was meant to send a message. Defiance against Assyria was futile. Yet beneath this terror lay extraordinary organization. The Assyrian army of Ashurnasirpal II was the most advanced military force of its time. Professional, disciplined, and supported by a logistics system unmatched in the ancient world. It was divided into specialized units of infantry, cavalry, and chariotry, coordinated through a network of supply bases and roads. Siege engineers constructed battering rams and ramps, allowing the Assyrians to take fortified cities with surgical precision. The army's efficiency made it possible to wage campaigns year after year, expanding the empire's reach deep into the Levant and across the Taurus Mountains. As his conquests grew, so did his need for control. Ashurnasirpal reorganized the empire into tightly managed provinces, each governed by a royal appointee responsible for collecting tribute, maintaining order, and mobilizing troops. Governors reported directly to the king, and failure meant execution. This centralized system allowed the Assyrian state to absorb newly conquered territories without fracturing under their weight. It was an empire built not just on conquest, but on administration. The wealth of empire flowed back to Assyria in tribute: gold and silver from the Levant, copper and tin from Anatolia, horses from the Iranian plateau, and timber from the mountains of Lebanon. This influx of resources transformed the heartland. The once austere cities of the Tigris began to shimmer with opulence. To reflect this new era, Ashurnasirpal II made a decision that would define his legacy. He built a new capital. The site he chose was Kalhu, known today as Nimrud, situated on the banks of the Tigris River. There he constructed one of the most magnificent cities of the ancient world. Within a few years, Kalhu became the beating heart of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, a symbol of power and divine favor. At its center stood the Northwest Palace, an immense complex adorned with colossal statues of winged bulls and walls lined with intricately carved reliefs. These reliefs told stories of conquest and piety, depicting the king leading his armies, hunting lions, and offering sacrifices to Ashur and the gods. Every image reinforced the ideology of Assyrian rule: the king as warrior, builder, and divine agent. Ashurnasirpal celebrated the completion of his new capital with a festival that became legendary. According to his inscriptions, he hosted a feast for nearly 70,000 guests, nobles, soldiers, craftsmen, and envoys from across the empire. Wine flowed, food overflowed, and music echoed through the palace halls. It was a spectacle of abundance and authority, a proclamation that Assyria had returned to its destiny. The message was clear. Under Ashurnasirpal II, the world was again bending toward the will of Ashur. But beyond the grandeur lay brutal efficiency. The king maintained his empire through a combination of awe and terror. Deportations became state policy. Conquered peoples were relocated across the empire to repopulate devastated areas, work on royal projects, and dilute local identities. This system, harsh but effective, turned diversity into strength, creating a multi-ethnic empire bound by fear and bureaucracy. Over time, this strategy would allow Assyria to sustain control over distant territories for centuries. Culturally, Ashurnasirpal II presided over a renaissance. Art, architecture, and literature flourished under royal patronage. The bas-reliefs of Kalhu, depicting mythic beasts and ceremonial hunts, represent some of the most refined artistry of the ancient Near East. The Assyrians combined symbolic precision with narrative power. Every figure, gesture, and line served a political purpose. Even the king's famed lion hunts, depicted in dozens of scenes, were not mere sport, but sacred ritual, the triumph of divine order over chaos. When Ashurnasirpal II died in 859 BCE, he left behind a realm larger, richer, and more centralized than any before it. His capital gleamed, his army was unmatched, and his ideology had crystallized into something eternal. The belief that the king, chosen by the gods, must bring all lands under divine order. The world had learned to fear the name of Assyria, but the machine he built demanded constant motion, and it fell to his son, Shalmaneser III, to keep it running. Shalmaneser III inherited an empire poised for further expansion. From the moment he took the throne, he waged nearly continuous campaigns. His armies struck into Urartu in the north, the Zagros in the east, and Syria in the west. The king's annals record his travels in astonishing detail, year by year, city by city, battle by battle. His purpose was not only conquest, but maintenance, to ensure that every vassal knew the cost of rebellion. One of the defining events of his reign was the Battle of Karkar in 853 BCE. As Shalmaneser advanced into Syria, a grand coalition of kings united to resist him, an alliance that included Hadadezer of Damascus, Ahab of Israel, and rulers from Hamath, Arvad, and Egypt. It was one of the largest coalitions in Near Eastern history, a desperate attempt to stop Assyrian expansion. The battle was ferocious. Shalmaneser claimed victory in his inscriptions, boasting of tens of thousands slain and the enemy's flight. Yet the outcome remains debated. Most historians believe the battle was indecisive, a brutal stalemate that halted Assyria's westward advance for a time. Still, the very existence of such a coalition testified to the terror Assyria inspired. Despite setbacks, Shalmaneser's campaigns reshaped the political map. Over the next 3 decades, he continued to push westward, subduing city-states and extracting tribute. His army reached the shores of the Mediterranean and the mountains of Armenia. His monuments, such as the Black Obelisk, immortalized his victories. The obelisk, now one of the most iconic Assyrian artifacts, depicts rulers from across the Near East bowing before him, including Jehu of Israel, shown kneeling in submission. Each scene captures the theater of empire, the king towering above, his enemies prostrate, tribute piled high before him. But as Shalmaneser aged, the empire's unity began to fray. Endless warfare drained resources, and the central administration grew strained. Toward the end of his reign, internal rivalries erupted into civil war. His sons fought for power, provincial governors grew ambitious, and the great machine began to sputter. When Shalmaneser died around 824 BCE, the empire he had fought to hold together stood at the edge of fragmentation. Yet even in turbulence, Assyria endured. The structures created by Ashurnasirpal II and Shalmaneser III, the professional army, the provincial system, the ideology of divine kingship, were too strong to vanish. They would carry the empire through decades of instability and, under new rulers, drive it toward heights yet unseen. The Assyrian storm had gathered. Now it was spreading. The world had felt its first shock, but the greatest tempests were still to come, Huai Age of Reform. The rise of Tiglath-Pileser III and the birth of the Assyrian superpower. When Shalmaneser III died in 1824 BCE, the empire he and his father had carved out stretched from the mountains of Anatolia to the deserts of Syria. Yet beneath its grandeur, cracks had begun to spread. Decades of constant war had drained its resources. The loyalty of provincial governors wavered, and the royal court seethed with rival factions. For nearly a century, Assyria drifted through decline, a giant still standing, but uncertain of its own strength. Then, in the mid-8th century BCE, a new figure emerged, who would transform the empire beyond recognition. His name was Tiglath-Pileser III, and under his rule, Assyria would become the first true superpower of the ancient world. Before his rise, Assyria was on the verge of collapse. The long civil wars following Shalmaneser's death had weakened central authority. Successive kings, Shamshi-Adad V, Adad-Nirari III, and Ashur-Nirari V, struggled to hold the empire together. Governors in far-flung provinces acted as independent lords, hoarding tribute and raising their own armies. The royal treasury emptied, the once mighty army fractured into regional militias, and rebellions flared across the frontier. For many it seemed that Assyria's golden age had passed. But within this chaos, One man saw opportunity. In 745 BCE, amid unrest in the capital city of Kalhu, a military officer named Pulu seized power. History would remember him by his throne name, Tiglath-Pileser III. Whether he was of royal blood or a usurper remains debated, but there was no doubt about his purpose. From the moment he took the throne, Tiglath-Pileser began one of the most radical transformations in the history of empire. His reign would not merely restore Assyria, it would reinvent it. His first and most revolutionary act was to break the power of the provincial elite. The old system, created in the days of Ashurnasirpal II, had allowed governors to accumulate vast territories and wealth, eventually rivaling the king himself. Tiglath-Pileser dismantled this structure with ruthless precision. He divided large provinces into smaller administrative units, each governed by an appointed official directly accountable to the crown. Governors were now rotated frequently to prevent local dynasties from forming, and their power was checked by royal inspectors, men loyal only to the king. The result was a centralized bureaucracy unprecedented in the ancient world. Alongside these reforms came the creation of a professional standing army, perhaps Tiglath-Pileser's most enduring innovation. Previous Assyrian armies had been seasonal forces, raised for specific campaigns and disbanded afterward. Under Tiglath-Pileser, the army became a permanent institution. Soldiers were trained year-round, organized into specialized units of infantry, cavalry, and archers. Provincial populations were required to provide manpower through conscription, and foreign subjects were drafted into auxiliary units. The result was an empire that could wage continuous warfare without pause, an unstoppable military machine. Equally transformative was his mastery of logistics. Roads were repaired and expanded. Supply depots were established across the empire. Communication between capitals and frontiers was streamlined through relay systems. For the first time, Assyria could project power rapidly across thousands of miles. Campaigns that once required years could now be executed in months. The empire had discovered the rhythm of perpetual motion. Ideologically, Tiglath-Pileser III redefined kingship itself. In his inscriptions, he presented himself not merely as a warrior or ruler, but as the chosen agent of the god Ashur, sent to impose divine order upon the earth. "I am the avenger of the gods," one inscription declares. "I sweep away rebellion and bring the peoples beneath the yoke of Ashur." His victories were framed as acts of purification, his conquests as sacred missions. The language of empire and theology became one. The first test of this reformed state came swiftly. The Aramean tribes, long the bane of Assyria's western frontier, had formed small kingdoms in Syria and along the Euphrates. Among them, Arpad and Hamath emerged as powerful centers of resistance. Tiglath-Pileser struck with ferocity. In 743 BCE, he besieged Arpad for 3 years, capturing it and deporting its population. Hamath followed soon after. Entire cities were emptied, their inhabitants resettled deep within Assyria. These deportations, while brutal, served a dual purpose. They eliminated rebellion and repopulated underdeveloped regions of the empire with skilled laborers. It was demographic engineering on an imperial scale. By the end of the decade, the Western Levant, from the Euphrates to the Mediterranean, had fallen under Assyrian control. City-states that had once been proud and independent now paid tribute in gold, silver, cedar, and horses. From Damascus to Tyre, emissaries came bearing gifts, bowing before the throne of Ashur's king. In a single generation, Tiglath-Pileser had transformed the patchwork of small kingdoms into a unified imperial network. His ambitions did not stop there. To the south, Assyria's ancient rival Babylonia had grown unstable, torn by factionalism among its Chaldean and Aramean tribes. Tiglath-Pileser intervened, first as conqueror, then as ruler. In 729 BCE, he took the unprecedented step of crowning himself king of Babylon, uniting the two ancient centers of Mesopotamian civilization under one crown. This dual monarchy symbolized not only political supremacy, but cosmic balance, the union of Ashur's northern might with Marduk's southern sanctity. For the first time in history, one man ruled all of Mesopotamia. The king's reforms extended beyond politics and war. He oversaw a massive building program that revitalized Assyrian cities. Kalhu, his capital, became a center of administration and ceremony, filled with new palaces, temples, and warehouses. Reliefs from his reign depict scenes of order and abundance, scribes recording tribute, soldiers parading before the king, envoys carrying exotic gifts from distant lands. These images were propaganda, but also a reflection of truth. Tiglath-Pileser's empire was organized, efficient, and immensely wealthy. Under his rule, the practice of mass deportation became state policy, systematized into the machinery of empire. Unlike earlier kings, who used it as punishment, Tiglath-Pileser turned deportation into a tool of management. Entire populations were moved according to imperial need. Craftsmen resettled where their skills were required, farmers relocated to underused lands, and rebellious tribes dispersed among loyal provinces. By breaking ethnic and regional identities, he forged a cohesive imperial society held together by bureaucracy and fear. It was one of history's earliest examples of deliberate social engineering. Culturally, the Assyrian court flourished. The royal scribes produced detailed annals of conquest and administration, while artisans perfected the empire's distinctive style of monumental art. The image of the king as divine warrior, serene yet terrible, dominated palace reliefs. Tiglath-Pileser's likeness, carved with sharp eyes and a calm expression, radiated the authority of a man who believed himself eternal. By the end of his reign, around 727 BCE, Tiglath-Pileser III had achieved what no Assyrian king before him had dared imagine. The empire's borders stretched from the Zagros Mountains to the Mediterranean Sea, from the highlands of Urartu to the deserts of Arabia. The administration was efficient, the army professional, the ideology absolute. He had created not merely a kingdom, but a system, a model of empire that would outlive him and influence the great powers that followed. Babylon, Persia, even Rome. Tiglath-Pileser died having turned Assyria into a machine of power, wealth, and order, a superpower in every sense. But his legacy would not rest peacefully. His successors would inherit not only his empire, but his unrelenting momentum. The machine he built could never stop moving. Its strength depended on perpetual conquest. And so, when his son Shalmaneser V ascended the throne, the empire's gaze turned once again westward, toward rebellion in Israel, intrigue in Egypt, and the restless promise of eternal dominion. The fall of Samaria and the rise of Sargon II. The empire renewed by blood and stone. When Tiglath-Pileser III died in 727 BCE, he left behind a transformed empire, centralized, militarized, and bound by iron discipline. Yet his greatest creation was also his greatest burden. The Neo-Assyrian Empire had become a colossal machine that could not afford to stop. Its armies, its bureaucracy, even its ideology depended on constant expansion. Tribute had to flow. Victories had to be recorded. Enemies had to be conquered to prove the gods still favored Assyria. Into this unrelenting world stepped his successor, Shalmaneser V, inheriting not peace, but motion. Shalmaneser's reign began with stability. The empire's foundations were firm, its armies seasoned, its vassals obedient, at least for the moment. But rebellion, as ever, simmered in the west. In the Levant, small kingdoms like Israel, Tyre, and Damascus had long been caught between submission and defiance. Among them, the Kingdom of Israel, though weakened by internal divisions, remained strategically vital. Its hilltop capital, Samaria, commanded the trade routes linking Egypt and Mesopotamia. Control of Samaria meant control of the land bridge between continents, and Assyria would not tolerate disobedience there. At first, Israel's king, Hoshea, maintained a fragile loyalty. He paid tribute to Assyria, acknowledging its supremacy. But as Shalmaneser settled into power, Hoshea saw opportunity. Egypt, under its resurgent 25th dynasty, had begun to extend influence northward, offering gold, promises, and encouragement to the restless states of Syria-Palestine. Emboldened, Hoshea rebelled. He withheld tribute, declared independence, and sought Egyptian support. For the Assyrians, it was an unforgivable act, a challenge not only to the king but to the cosmic order itself. Shalmaneser responded, as Assyrian kings always did, with war. In 724 BCE, the Assyrian army marched westward, a disciplined force of tens of thousands. They advanced through Syria with grim inevitability, crushing resistance city by city. When they reached Samaria, they laid siege to it. The city was formidable, perched on a hill and ringed by double walls, supplied by underground cisterns. For 3 long years, the siege dragged on. The Assyrians encamped below the walls, cutting off trade, starving the defenders. Their engineers built earthen ramps and battering towers. Their archers rained volleys upon the battlements. Inside, famine and disease took hold. The fall of Samaria, recorded in both Assyrian annals and the Hebrew Bible, stands as one of the defining moments of the 8th century BCE. Yet the question of who ultimately conquered it remains debated. Shalmaneser began the siege, but he died before it ended. Perhaps suddenly, perhaps violently. Into the power vacuum stepped a new figure, a man whose rise was as mysterious as it was momentous. Sargon II. Unlike his predecessors, Sargon was not of direct royal descent. His throne name, meaning the true king, echoed that of Sargon of Akkad, the legendary founder of Mesopotamia's first empire. Whether this was coincidence or deliberate symbolism, it sent a clear message. Sargon would restore legitimacy through action. His ascent may have been a coup, but it was one that would redefine Assyria's destiny, and his first act was to claim the glory of Samaria's fall. According to Sargon's inscriptions, it was he who captured Samaria in 722 BCE, deporting 27,290 inhabitants and repopulating the region with settlers from other provinces. The rebellion was extinguished. The Kingdom of Israel ceased to exist. The deported Israelites were resettled across the empire, in Media, Assyria, and beyond, their identities gradually absorbed into the imperial fabric. Meanwhile, foreigners from conquered lands were settled in Samaria, creating a new, mixed population that would later be known as the Samaritans. The policy was cruelly efficient. Rebellion was erased by erasing its people. With this victory, Sargon secured his legitimacy. Yet the road ahead was perilous. To the north, the mountain kingdom of Urartu, centered around Lake Van in modern-day eastern Turkey, had become Assyria's most dangerous rival. Its kings, fortified in their citadels, had long resisted Assyrian dominance and even sponsored uprisings in the empire's western provinces. Sargon resolved to destroy them. His campaigns against Urartu were among the most audacious in Assyrian history. In 714 BCE, he led a vast army through the Zagros Mountains, navigating treacherous terrain and harsh weather to strike at the heart of Urartian power. The march was grueling. Thousands of soldiers and pack animals crossing steep passes and swollen rivers, but the results were spectacular. The Assyrians captured the Urartian holy city of Musasir, looting its temples and carrying off immense treasure. Among the spoils was the golden statue of the god Haldi, a humiliation that shattered Urartu's morale. The victory was immortalized in elaborate reliefs that once adorned Sargon's palace, depicting the king receiving tribute as divine symbols hovered above him. Through such imagery, conquest became theology, proof that the gods had vindicated the true king. Sargon's ambitions extended beyond war. Like Ashurnasirpal II before him, he sought to embody imperial renewal in stone. In 706 BCE, he began construction of a new capital city, Dur-Sharrukin, meaning fortress of Sargon. Situated northeast of Nineveh, it was a monumental statement of power and divine order. Its walls stretched over 16 kilometers, enclosing grand palaces, temples, gardens, and administrative buildings. The city was meticulously planned, streets aligned to cardinal directions, gates named for the gods, and reliefs depicting Sargon as both conqueror and shepherd of his people. At the palace entrance stood colossal lamassu, winged bulls with human faces, guardians of the throne and symbols of divine protection. Every brick, every carving, proclaimed the permanence of Assyrian dominion. Sargon's inscriptions reveal a man deeply conscious of legacy. He described himself as the governor whom Ashur and the great gods have named to rule over all nations, a servant of destiny rather than a mere mortal. Yet his reign was not without hardship. Rebellions flared in the west, where city-states like Gaza and Ashdod, emboldened by Egyptian intrigue, challenged Assyrian control. Sargon crushed them all, defeating Egyptian-backed coalitions and imposing vassal rulers. He also turned his attention eastward, subduing the Medes of the Iranian plateau and extending Assyrian influence toward the Caspian Sea. His empire spanned continents, encompassing peoples as diverse as Phoenicians, Persians, Israelites, and Armenians. Despite these triumphs, fate would deal Sargon a cruel end. In 705 BCE, during a campaign in Anatolia, he was killed in battle. His body never recovered. For the Assyrians, this was a terrible omen. To die unburied was to be denied passage to the afterlife, and for a king, it was a cosmic disgrace. The death of Sargon II cast a shadow over his accomplishments, unsettling the empire's spiritual balance. His newly built capital, Dur-Sharrukin, was abandoned almost immediately, never fully inhabited. The fortress of Sargon became a ghost city, a monument to ambition and the impermanence of power. Sargon's death ushered in a moment of uncertainty, but his achievements could not be undone. He had preserved and expanded the empire, humbled its enemies, and created one of the most architecturally ambitious capitals in ancient history. More importantly, he had redefined the Assyrian monarchy itself, a ruler not just by blood, but by divine right and victorious deeds. His legacy would shape the kings who followed, none more so than his son and successor, Sennacherib. When Sennacherib took the throne, he inherited a world trembling under the weight of Assyria's might and the curse of his father's unfinished glory. In his hands, the empire would reach dazzling new heights of architectural splendor and terrifying violence. But it would also sow the seeds of divine reckoning that would haunt Assyria's final years. The age of conquest was not yet over. It was about to burn brighter and darker than ever before. The siege of Jerusalem and the fury of Sennacherib, the empire of fire and stone. When Sargon II fell in battle in 705 BCE, unburied and unavenged, Assyria trembled. His sudden death was more than a political shock. It was a spiritual wound. The body of a king, believed to be the vessel of divine order, lay lost in foreign soil. For a people who measured power in both earthly and cosmic terms, this was an omen of chaos. Into this uncertain world stepped his son, Sennacherib, inheriting not only the empire's might, but also its unease. He would rule for nearly a quarter of a century, and under him, Assyria would reach new pinnacles of architectural glory, military ferocity, and moral infamy. Sennacherib's first act as king was to distance himself from his father's shadow, literally and symbolically. He abandoned Dur-Sharrukin, the grand but ill-fated capital that Sargon had built, and moved the royal seat to Nineveh, transforming it into a city of unmatched magnificence. The choice was both practical and ideological. Nineveh was ancient, sacred, and strategically located on the Tigris River. But more importantly, rebuilding it allowed Sennacherib to reassert divine favor, to prove that the gods had not abandoned Assyria despite his father's cursed death. Under his command, Nineveh became the jewel of the ancient world. He envisioned not merely a city, but a living monument to imperial power, a palace without rival, as his inscriptions boast. Massive walls encircled the city, stretching over 12 kilometers and punctuated by 15 monumental gates. Within, grand boulevards led to his palace, where sculpted reliefs depicted scenes of conquest, tribute, and ritual splendor. Vast gardens, irrigated by an ingenious system of aqueducts and canals, surrounded the capital. The most famous of these, the Jerwan Aqueduct, still stands today, a masterpiece of engineering built from stone blocks inscribed with his name. Water flowed into Nineveh from distant hills, feeding orchards and ornamental gardens that some scholars believe may have inspired the later legends of the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. But Sennacherib's vision was not confined to architecture. Like his forefathers, he saw himself as the divine executor of Ashur's will, the living sword of heaven. His reign was defined by perpetual motion, campaigns that radiated outward in all directions. To the east, he crushed the Elamites. To the north, he fought the Urartians, and to the west, he confronted the restless kingdoms of the Levant. Among these, one defiance would echo through eternity: the rebellion of Judah and the siege of Jerusalem. The roots of the conflict lay in the politics of the region. After the fall of Israel, the small kingdom of Judah, under King Hezekiah, remained as one of the few independent states in the Levant. For years, it had paid tribute to Assyria, maintaining a fragile peace. But when Sennacherib ascended the throne, Hezekiah saw a chance to break free. Encouraged by Egypt, which sought to challenge Assyrian dominance, Judah joined a coalition of rebel states that included Ekron, Ashkelon, and Sidon. It was a bold move, and a fatal one. In 701 BCE, Sennacherib marched west with overwhelming force. His army, estimated at over 200,000 men, was a moving city of soldiers, chariots, and siege engines. One by one, the rebel cities fell. Ashkelon was taken, Ekron was punished, Sidon surrendered without a fight. Then the king turned south toward Judah. The Assyrians swept across the land, capturing fortified towns and deporting their inhabitants. Sennacherib's own inscriptions, the famous Taylor Prism, record this campaign in meticulous detail. Now 46 of his strong walled cities and countless small villages I besieged and conquered. I carried away 250 people, young and old, male and female, horses, mules, camels, cattle, and sheep without number. Hezekiah fled behind the walls of Jerusalem, the last refuge of his kingdom. Sennacherib encamped outside, cutting off the city from food and water. The siege began. The biblical Book of Kings describes the terror of those days. The Assyrian army surrounded the city like a bird in a cage, and Sennacherib's envoys stood before the walls, taunting Hezekiah's defenders. "Do not let your God deceive you. No nation has escaped the king of Assyria." Yet Jerusalem did not fall. The biblical narrative tells of divine intervention, that a plague struck the Assyrian camp, killing thousands overnight and forcing the army to withdraw. Sennacherib's own records tell a different story. As for Hezekiah, "I shut him up like a caged bird in his royal city of Jerusalem. He sent to me after my conquest of his land, to pay tribute and to do homage." In truth, both accounts may hold fragments of reality. Jerusalem was spared, but Judah was broken. Hezekiah paid heavy tribute, gold, silver, ivory, and even his own daughters, to secure peace. Whether by plague, politics, or surrender, the city survived. But its independence was over. Assyria had reasserted its dominance, and Sennacherib's name became legend. The king who besieged Jerusalem and lived to boast of it. After his campaign in the Levant, Sennacherib turned his fury southward toward Babylon, where rebellion was once again stirring. His father's unification of the two kingdoms had always been uneasy. The Babylonians, proud heirs of an older civilization, resented Assyrian rule. Their ally, Elam, provided both support and sanctuary for rebels. Sennacherib's patience, already thin, broke when the Babylonian king Merodach-Baladan rose against him for the second time. The Assyrians captured Babylon, deposed its rulers, and razed its fortifications. Yet rebellion flared again. Finally, in 689 BCE, Sennacherib resolved to end the problem once and for all. His army descended upon Babylon in a storm of vengeance. The city that had stood as a symbol of Mesopotamian greatness for over 1,000 years was utterly destroyed. In his own words, "I swept over the city like the deluge. I destroyed its walls, its temples, and its foundations. I made its site like a field for plowing. I carried away the gods who dwelt there and caused them to dwell in Ashur's temples." It was the most shocking act of sacrilege in Mesopotamian history. To annihilate Babylon, home of Marduk, the great god of balance and creation, was to shatter the spiritual order of the region. Even among Assyrians, many saw the act as impious, an offense against heaven itself. Sennacherib had claimed victory, but the price was cosmic. The destruction of Babylon haunted him. Though his inscriptions boasted of triumph, later accounts whisper of divine retribution. In 681 BCE, the king was assassinated by his own sons while praying in a temple, struck down, it was said, as punishment for his arrogance and impiety. His murderers fled to the mountains of Ararat, and the throne passed to his younger son, Esarhaddon. Despite his brutal end, Sennacherib's reign left an indelible mark. He was a paradox, a destroyer who built wonders, a tyrant who expanded the boundaries of art and engineering. His vision of Nineveh transformed it into the crown of the ancient world, and his campaigns reaffirmed Assyria's supremacy from the Zagros Mountains to the Mediterranean Sea. Yet his downfall revealed the fatal flaw at the empire's heart. The same divine pride that had built Assyria's greatness could also summon its ruin. As his son Esarhaddon ascended the throne, he inherited not only the empire, but the burden of redemption, to rebuild what his father had destroyed, and to reconcile the wrath of gods and men. The sword had conquered, but the soul of the empire now demanded healing. The healer of Babylon and the conqueror of Egypt, the reign of Esarhaddon and the triumph of Ashurbanipal. When Sennacherib fell to the blades of his own sons in 681 BCE, the empire he left behind was both magnificent and cursed. Its borders stretched from the mountains of Urartu to the shores of the Mediterranean, but its moral and spiritual foundations had been shaken by the destruction of Babylon, the ancient heart of Mesopotamian civilization. Temples lay in ruins, priests scattered, and the people whispered that Assyria's god Ashur had turned his face away. It was in this shadow, between glory and guilt, that his youngest son, Esarhaddon, ascended the throne. His reign would be one of rebuilding, reconciliation, and renewed conquest. He would mend what his father had broken, restore divine balance, and in doing so, prepare the empire for its final, radiant zenith. Esarhaddon's path to power was not easy. After Sennacherib's assassination, his elder brothers seized the throne, ruling briefly from Nineveh before civil war erupted. With the support of loyal generals and divine omen, Esarhaddon marched from the western provinces to claim the crown. His victory was swift but hard-won. His first royal inscriptions read not as boasts, but as prayers. "The gods looked upon me," he wrote, "and chose me to repair the destruction." This tone would define his rule. Humility before the gods paired with the steely resolve of an Assyrian king. His first great act was one of atonement. The ghost of Babylon, the city his father had destroyed, loomed large over Assyria's conscience. To rule without its favor was to rule under a curse. Esarhaddon moved quickly to reverse his father's sin. He proclaimed the rebuilding of Babylon, issuing edicts to restore its temples, walls, and canals. He ordered the return of sacred statues looted by Sennacherib, including the image of Marduk, the city's supreme god. In a symbolic gesture of submission, he knelt before Marduk's statue and declared that the gods themselves had commanded him to renew the bond between heaven and earth. This act of reconciliation was both political and spiritual genius. By restoring Babylon, Esarhaddon re-established Assyria's legitimacy in the eyes of its southern subjects and its priestly elites. The city rose again, brick by brick, its ziggurats gleaming in the sunlight. The priests blessed Esarhaddon as the restorer of divine harmony, and the omen readers proclaimed that Ashur and Marduk were reconciled. The empire's moral balance had been restored, and with it, its confidence. Once peace returned to Mesopotamia, Esarhaddon turned outward. His ambitions reached beyond the Tigris and Euphrates, toward the great kingdoms of the West. For centuries, Egypt had loomed as both rival and enigma, a land of immense wealth, ancient gods, and restless influence. Under the 25th dynasty, ruled by Pharaoh Taharka of Kushite descent, Egypt had supported rebellions against Assyrian rule in the Levant. To secure his empire's borders, Esarhaddon knew he had to confront the Nile. His first campaign against Egypt, launched in 674 BCE, was a failure. The desert routes were harsh, the enemy well prepared, and the Assyrian army forced to retreat. Many kings might have accepted defeat, but Esarhaddon learned from it. Over the next 3 years, he rebuilt his forces, fortified supply lines through Phoenicia and Palestine, and assembled one of the largest armies Assyria had ever seen. When he marched again in 671 BCE, the result was decisive. The Assyrian army stormed across the Sinai and into Egypt's delta, defeating Taharka's forces in open battle. They captured Memphis, the great city of the pharaohs, seizing royal treasures and members of the Egyptian court. Esarhaddon proclaimed himself King of Egypt, King of Kush, and King of the world. For the first time, the ancient lands of the Nile bowed to a ruler from Mesopotamia. The conquest was celebrated across Assyria as a cosmic triumph, the uniting of two cradles of civilization under one divine will. But Egypt, proud and ancient, would not remain subdued. Rebellions flared almost immediately, And though Esarhaddon installed loyal governors, the occupation was tenuous. His health began to fail during preparations for a third campaign. In 669 BCE, while marching once more toward the west, the king died. The sands of the desert closing over a monarch who had united the world's greatest lands, but could not outlast their weight. Before his death, Esarhaddon had taken a wise precaution. He divided his empire between his sons. Ashurbanipal, his favored heir, was named king of Assyria, while his elder brother, Shamash-shum-ukin, was appointed king of Babylon. The arrangement was meant to preserve peace, two brothers ruling in harmony over north and south. For a time it worked. Under Ashurbanipal, Assyria would reach the pinnacle of its glory, its borders stretching from the mountains of Iran to the sands of Egypt, from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea. Ashurbanipal's reign, 669–631 BCE, stands as the last and brightest chapter in Assyrian history, an age of empire, intellect, and ruthless might. He was not only a conqueror, but also a scholar, a king who could wield both the sword and the stylus. In his inscriptions he boasts, "I, Ashurbanipal, learned the wisdom of Nabu, mastered the art of writing, and read the tablets of the gods." He surrounded himself with scribes, priests, and scholars, overseeing the greatest collection of knowledge the ancient world had ever seen. The Library of Nineveh, this vast archive, filled with tens of thousands of clay tablets, preserved myths, laws, omens, and scientific texts from across Mesopotamia. Among its treasures was the Epic of Gilgamesh, the world's oldest epic poem. Thanks to Ashurbanipal's obsession with preserving wisdom, these works would survive the fall of his empire to inspire civilizations yet unborn. But Ashurbanipal's reign was not only one of intellect, it was also a reign of conquest. Like his father, he reasserted control over Egypt, crushing rebellions and installing Psammetichus I as a loyal vassal. To the east, he waged devastating wars against Elam, reducing it to ashes in a series of brutal campaigns. His inscriptions gloat with chilling pride. "I destroyed Susa, the city of Elam. I carried off its gods and kings, and I scattered its people to the winds." He even claims to have brought back the bones of Elamite kings as trophies, scattering them like dust before the storm. Ashurbanipal's empire was an iron colossus. From his throne in Nineveh, he commanded a realm connected by royal roads, fortified cities, and a bureaucracy that recorded every tribute, decree, and punishment. Envoys from distant lands bowed before him, bringing gifts of gold, lapis, and ivory. Artists carved his triumphs into reliefs that adorned palace walls, scenes of lion hunts, royal feasts, and armies marching in divine formation. In one iconic relief, the king is depicted driving an arrow into a charging lion, not for sport, but as sacred ritual. The lion symbolized chaos, its defeat, the restoration of cosmic order. Yet beneath this splendor lay growing strain. The dual monarchy Esarhaddon had established began to fracture. In Babylon, Shamash-shum-ukin, weary of serving as his brother's subordinate, rebelled. The civil war that followed tore the empire apart. For years, Assyrian armies besieged Babylon, until at last the city fell and the rebel king perished in flames. Ashurbanipal restored order, but the unity of the empire had been fatally wounded. Even so, during his final years, Nineveh glittered with unmatched brilliance. Its libraries, temples, and palaces stood as monuments to 3 centuries of Assyrian dominance. The empire's wealth and knowledge seemed limitless, its king almost godlike. But history, ever patient, was already turning its gaze elsewhere. In the east, The Medes were rising. In the south, a resurgent Babylon was stirring, and beyond the empire's western deserts, unseen forces gathered, waiting for the storm to pass. For now, though, the world belonged to Assyria. Ashurbanipal ruled an empire at its zenith, vast, rich, and ordered, yet built on foundations of fear and exhaustion. The gods had given their blessing, but as the old proverb warned, when the gods favor a man too greatly, they hasten his ruin. The twilight of empire was approaching, and its light, like that of a dying sun, would burn brighter than ever before it fell. The twilight of empire, the fall of Nineveh and the end of Assyria. By the end of the 7th century BCE, the empire of Ashurbanipal seemed eternal. From the mountains of Anatolia to the Persian Gulf, from the deserts of Arabia to the shores of the Mediterranean, all bowed before Assyria's might. Its armies were unmatched, its bureaucracy precise, its cities magnificent beyond imagination. Nineveh, the palace without rival, stood as the beating heart of a world-spanning machine, a city of stone and flame, of scholars and soldiers, of gods and kings. Yet beneath this grandeur, the foundations were cracking. The same machinery that had built the empire's glory had begun to grind it to dust. When Ashurbanipal died, sometime around 631 BCE, the empire lost not only its ruler, but its balance. The long years of conquest and civil war had drained its strength. Provinces bled from overtaxation, armies were weary, and the unity imposed by terror began to unravel. The throne passed uncertainly from one successor to another, their names scarcely preserved in the fragments of history. The mighty engine of empire, once driven by ambition and faith, now lurched forward by habit alone. Within the empire, rebellion stirred. The Babylonians, long resentful of Assyrian domination, rose first. Led by a nobleman named Nabopolassar, they seized control of Babylon around 626 BCE, proclaiming independence and rallying southern Mesopotamia to their cause. At first, Assyrian armies responded with familiar fury, marching south to crush the uprising. But victory proved elusive. The empire's resources were stretched thin. Communication lines faltered. For the first time in centuries, the Assyrians faced an enemy they could not simply overwhelm. Meanwhile, in the rugged lands of the east, a new power was rising. The Medes, an Iranian people who had long been vassals and foes by turns. Under their king Cyaxares, they united their tribes into a disciplined force, adopting many of the military techniques the Assyrians themselves had perfected. In 614 BCE, the Medes struck, invading northern Assyria and capturing the ancient city of Ashur, the spiritual heart of the empire. The sack of Ashur was brutal. Temples burned, statues of gods were shattered, and the city that had given Assyria its name was left in ruins. It was more than a military defeat. It was the death of a soul. The Babylonians and Medes soon formed an alliance, a coalition born of vengeance and necessity. Together, they turned their eyes toward the greatest prize of all, Nineveh. By this time, Nineveh was still a marvel, but a vulnerable one. Its walls, said to stretch 12 kilometers and rise as high as 30 meters, enclosed a city of palaces, gardens, libraries, and temples. The new king, Sennacherib, ruled from its throne, desperately trying to hold the empire together. He must have known that the enemies gathering beyond his walls were not mere raiders or rebels, but avengers of centuries of Assyrian cruelty. In 612 BCE, the coalition armies of Medes, Babylonians, and Scythians encircled Nineveh. The siege that followed was long and merciless. The attackers used the very techniques the Assyrians had invented: battering rams, siege ramps, and sappers tunneling beneath the walls. For months the city resisted, its defenders fighting with the desperation of a people who understood there would be no mercy. Chronicles from Babylon describe the campaign with chilling brevity. They made a great slaughter of the people, and they carried off the spoil of the city and the temple, and they turned the city into a ruin heap. Nineveh's fall was not only military, but apocalyptic. Ancient sources later claimed that the Tigris River itself, swollen with rain, broke its banks and flooded part of the city, undermining the walls. Whether myth or truth, the symbolism was clear. Nature itself had turned against the empire that once claimed divine favor. The Assyrian king perished amid the flames, perhaps by his own hand. The great palace of Sennacherib collapsed, burying beneath it the vast library of Ashurbanipal, thousands of clay tablets that would, centuries later, whisper Assyria's story to the modern world. When the fires died, Nineveh was no more. Its streets were choked with ash and corpses, its temples toppled, its gods desecrated. The city that had once called itself the center of the world was silent. The fall of Nineveh sent shockwaves across the Near East. Nations that had lived in fear of Assyria for centuries rejoiced. In the Hebrew scriptures, prophets like Nahum and Zephaniah celebrated its destruction as divine justice. Woe to the city of blood, full of lies, full of plunder, never without victims. The fire will devour you, and the sword will cut you off. And so it was. The Assyrian Empire, the first to master the art of organized conquest, the first to build a bureaucracy that ruled continents, vanished almost overnight. What had taken centuries to forge was erased in a generation, but Assyria did not disappear entirely. A few survivors, led by a prince named Ashurnasirpal II, fled west to the city of Haran, where they attempted to rally the remnants of the army. For several years, they resisted, holding out against the encroaching coalition. The last spark of Assyrian resistance flickered there until 609 BCE, when Haran too fell. With its capture, the Assyrian state ceased to exist. From the ashes of its empire, two new powers arose: Babylon under Nabopolassar and his son Nebuchadnezzar's son, and Media under Cyaxares. These empires divided the Assyrian territories between them, carrying forward its administrative systems, its military innovations, and even its art. In this way, Assyria lived on, not as a nation, but as an idea. Centuries later, the ruins of Nineveh lay buried under the sands near modern Mosul, its name remembered only in legend and scripture. Travelers passed over its mounds, unaware that beneath their feet slept one of the greatest civilizations the world had ever known. It was not until the 19th century CE that explorers like Austen Henry Layard began to uncover its secrets. From the soil emerged the winged bulls of Sennacherib's palace, the reliefs of lion hunts, and the clay tablets of Ashurbanipal's library, frozen voices of a lost empire. These discoveries astonished the modern world. The Assyrians, long remembered as villains in biblical lore, were revealed as builders, artists, and thinkers of immense sophistication. Their libraries preserved the earliest scientific texts. Their architecture influenced generations of builders. Their systems of governance shaped the empires that followed. From Babylon to Persia, from Greece to Rome, echoes of Assyria's order and ambition endured. The story of Assyria is not merely one of conquest, but of transformation, the eternal cycle of rise, glory, and fall. It reminds us that empires, like the kings who build them, are mortal. The Assyrians believed that by inscribing their deeds in stone, they could defy time. And in a sense, they succeeded. Though their cities turned to dust, their words remain, etched in clay, surviving the centuries. In the end, The empire that once called itself King of the Universe left behind not dominion, but memory. Its legacy lived on in every bureaucracy that followed, every monument raised to heaven, every ruler who claimed divine right. Assyria had taught the world how to build an empire, and by its fall, how such empires die. The legacy of Assyria, echoes of an empire reborn in stone and memory. Long after the fall of Nineveh in 612 BCE, the name Assyria lingered like a phantom across history, whispered in scriptures, feared in legends, and buried beneath the dust of its own magnificence. Its kings were gone, its cities silent, but its shadow stretched across the centuries. For though empires may die, their memory does not. It is absorbed by the civilizations that follow, reshaped, retold, and reborn. Assyria's story, one of conquest, creation, and collapse, became the blueprint of empire itself. In the centuries that followed its destruction, the Assyrian idea did not vanish. The Neo-Babylonian Empire, born from its ashes, inherited Assyria's administrative systems, its provincial governance, and its ideology of universal kingship. The Babylonians perfected the architecture of empire that the Assyrians had first imagined. The centralization of power, the division of provinces, the collection of tribute, and the use of monumental art to broadcast royal glory. In every Babylonian inscription that proclaimed the king as ruler of the four quarters of the earth, the echo of Ashur's empire still resounded. When Cyrus the Great of Persia conquered Babylon in 539 BCE, he too inherited Assyria's model of empire. The Persians expanded upon it, blending efficiency with tolerance, turning the iron discipline of Assyria into the moral code of governance. The royal road that stretched from Susa to Sardis, the satrapal system that governed distant lands, even the language of kingship, all bore Assyria's imprint. The Persians replaced Ashur with Ahura Mazda, but the vision remained the same. One king ruling a world in divine order. Assyria's influence reached even farther. The Greeks, who would one day challenge the East, encountered echoes of Assyria through Persian grandeur and Babylonian memory. Herodotus wrote of the Assyrian kings as ancient rulers of Asia, blending fact and myth. To the Greeks and later the Romans, Assyria became a symbol of both tyranny and civilization, the prototype of imperial ambition. The image of vast walled cities, disciplined armies, and godlike monarchs haunted their imagination. When Alexander the Great marched through the ruins of Nineveh on his way to Babylon, he walked among the ghosts of those who had first dreamed of global dominion. But for more than 2,000 years, Assyria's true face was forgotten. Its cities were swallowed by the earth. Its language, Akkadian, written in wedge-shaped cuneiform, became a lost tongue. Only in the 19th century CE did the ancient empire rise again, not through conquest, but through discovery. In 1843, the French consul Paul-Émile Botta began excavations at Khorsabad, uncovering the ruins of Dur-Sharrukin, the lost capital of Sargon II. His finds, colossal winged bulls and walls covered with carved reliefs, stunned Europe. Shortly after, the British explorer Austen Henry Layard unearthed Nineveh and Nimrud, revealing the palaces of Sennacherib and Ashurnasirpal II. For the first time in millennia, the Assyrian kings rose again from the dust, their faces calm, their eyes fixed on eternity. Layard's discoveries transformed human understanding of the ancient world. The massive stone reliefs he sent to the British Museum, depicting lion hunts, battles, and rituals, showed a civilization of astonishing sophistication. Assyria was no longer just a biblical villain. It was a lost world of art, engineering, and intellect. Soon after, Archaeologists uncovered Ashurbanipal's library at Nineveh. Over 30,000 clay tablets inscribed with the knowledge of the ancient world. Within them were mathematical treatises, legal codes, astronomical charts, and the Epic of Gilgamesh, the oldest surviving masterpiece of human literature. It was as if the Assyrians had anticipated their own oblivion and left a message in clay for the future. Through these discoveries, modern civilization rediscovered its ancient roots. Assyria's contributions to governance, urban planning, and written knowledge became clear. Its cities had pioneered paved roads, aqueducts, postal routes, and archives, the arteries of all later states. Its bureaucrats had invented the administrative tablet, the precursor of the ledger and the report. Its kings had created the concept of empire not as a territory, but as an idea, a unifying order under divine law. In its rise and fall lay a pattern that would repeat endlessly in human history. The cycle of power, innovation, and hubris. The Assyrians were also among the first to understand the power of narrative. Their reliefs were not mere decoration, but propaganda carved in stone, a visual language designed to shape memory. Each battle scene, each depiction of tribute and conquest, was a message to both subject and successor. This is what kingship means. Even their cruelty had a purpose. By inscribing terror into the landscape, they maintained control without constant war. In this sense, Assyria's greatest invention was not its army or architecture, but the psychology of empire, the art of rule through awe. Yet beyond the fear and power lies another legacy: resilience. The descendants of the ancient Assyrians never disappeared entirely. Through centuries of conquest and exile, they survived, converting to Christianity in late antiquity and preserving fragments of their language in Syriac, a dialect descended from Akkadian and Aramaic. Today, the Assyrian people, scattered across Iraq, Syria, Turkey, and the global diaspora, still call themselves by the name of their ancestors. They celebrate Akitu, the spring festival of renewal that once honored Ashur. They speak of Nineveh not as myth, but as heritage. Against all odds, they remain the living echo of an empire long thought dead. In modern scholarship, Assyria stands as both warning and wonder. It showed humanity what organization, discipline, and belief could achieve, and what arrogance could destroy. Its rulers saw themselves as divine, and for centuries the world seemed to agree. But when they overreached, when their pride exceeded their God's patience, even their walls of stone could not save them. The Assyrian story endures because it speaks to every age: the fragility of greatness, the cost of ambition, and the enduring power of memory. Today, the ruins of Nineveh, Ashur, and Nimrud lie once again in the troubled lands of northern Iraq. They have witnessed not only the rise and fall of ancient empires, but the violence of modern ones. Yet even as wars scar the earth, archaeologists, historians, and descendants labor to preserve what remains, to guard the stones, to read the tablets, to keep the voice of Assyria alive. In the museum halls of London, Paris, and Baghdad, the winged bulls still stand, silent, watchful, eternal, guardians of a civilization that once called itself the ruler of all. And perhaps, in a sense, it still is. For every empire that has risen since, Babylon, Persia, Rome, Byzantium, Britain, has followed the path Assyria first carved into history. Its vision of centralized power, divine kingship, and organized control became the template for all who sought to rule the world. Even in ruins, Assyria endures, not as an empire of earth, but as an empire of the human mind. From the banks of the Tigris, where merchants first carried tin and textiles, to the palaces of Nineveh, where kings commanded armies of nations, to the libraries that preserved the first human words. The story of Assyria is the story of civilization itself. It is a reminder that greatness, though fleeting, leaves traces that time cannot erase. The Assyrians carved their truth into stone so it would outlast death. And they were right. Long after their empire fell, long after their cities burned and their gods were forgotten, their words still speak. I am king of the universe, chosen of the gods, builder of cities, bringer of order. My name endures as long as the sun and moon endure. And so it does.